welcome to the stage our first speaker. He's a YouTuber, writer, TEDx speaker, and soon he will become a vegan campout speaker. Let's welcome to the stage Alex O'Connor, aka CosmicSkeptic!
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay? That's great. That's one of the nicer welcomes I've received when talking about this subject. It's wonderful. Well, hello everyone, ladies, gentlemen, friends, conspecifics. Thanks all for being here. It's a pleasure to be seemingly opening, I suppose, this Glastonbury for the plant-based. It's good to see. It's good to see so many people here. I must say that when I was first given the invitation to speak here, when I first accepted, I did really struggle to think what I could possibly say to a room full of vegans for half an hour. I mean, usually when I'm talking about the subject, it's to an audience of largely unimpressed scowls and eyebrows raised in incredulity, so it's nice to be speaking in less hostile territory for once. Yeah. Usually I would begin with some kind of theatrical point about animal suffering that I don't think any of you need to hear, so I suppose I can just begin by saying, well done, everybody. Keep it up. Keep up the good work. This is great. I've been doing this now for just over 2 years, having ditched animal products in April of 2019, but compared to some of the other veterans of this festival, that still makes me relatively new to animal rights advocacy, and I should say how thankful I am for the vegan community for so hospitably embracing this pretentious atheist YouTuber into its fold. It's wonderful to see. For a long time before I made anything, any kind of content about animal rights, I was almost exclusively what you'd call an atheist YouTuber. I was making content discussing faith, debating the religious, and I had been asked once or twice what I thought about veganism. It's a topic that comes up every now and again, but it was easy enough to ignore. Right? I kind of understood that it was wrong. I saw what people thought eating meat was wrong, but I thought it was wrong in the way that lying was wrong or something. Like, yeah, sure, it's not a great thing to do, but everybody does it, and it's not that bad, and at any rate, I know I can get away with doing it for a long time without anybody giving me any backlash. So it was kind of like when I'd walk past books about giving to charity, and I thought, look, I don't need to buy this book. Right? I understand what the problem is. I don't need to be convinced that giving to charity is good. It was the same thing with animal rights. I get the point. But then I decided to actually get down to it, and I read Animal Liberation by Peter Singer, and I suddenly realized just how catastrophically wrong I'd been. Like so many others, I'd been scammed into thinking that the animals I were eating had a relatively good life before their demise, and that perhaps I was actually doing them a favor by making sure they stay in existence, by making sure I was continuing to buy them. It's an interesting point, actually, this argument that if everyone went vegan overnight, that the animals would go extinct and that we're doing them a favor by bringing them into existence. Especially given that I'm simultaneously met with the fear that if everybody goes vegan overnight, what are we going to do with all the animals? They're going to overrun us. It's like a simultaneous fear that the cows are going to overrun us and we won't know what to do with them, but at the same time a fear that they're going to go extinct. It's like people can't make up their minds on this. But interestingly, there is a rebuttal to this particular point that comes from a rather unlikely source, I think, of Robert Nozick, who in Anarchy, State and Utopia, I think it's not often stressed, a lot of people don't seem to know, talked about, briefly, animal rights, or at least the eating of animals. And I think in the true libertarian spirit that any true libertarian should ascribe to, he seemed sympathetic to the idea that we shouldn't be eating animals. And when he considered this idea that by eating animals we might actually be doing them a favor by making them stay into existence, he asks that if our taste buds changed and we no longer found it enjoyable to eat animals, should those people who are concerned, who make this argument that we're doing them a favor, even though they don't like the way it tastes anymore, just continue to breathe them into existence and eat them anyway out of a virtuous behavior? It's obviously ridiculous. And I have to say that I'm quite embarrassed that I spent so long of my life contributing to this kind of stuff without really giving it a proper second thought. I'm often asked if I judge people who continue to purchase animal products, and I have to say that there's only one person I can legitimately judge in that regard, and it's my former self. Having spent 20 years of my life contributing to this industry, I consider what I'm doing now, this kind of stuff, as a way of making up for it, as a way of trying to find a way to forgive myself, because God knows that if the animals that I was responsible for torturing, killing, and abusing were given the opportunity, they sure as hell wouldn't forgive me. So that's why I'm here today, right? Because one glance, a single glance at the cages, at the gas chambers, at the rape racks, at the macerators, one glance at all of this immediately shattered any illusions that I was harboring about animal welfare. And I immediately realized that this is an issue that demands attention. And that's why, despite only ever having wanted to just talk about philosophy of religion on YouTube, I now stand before you today as an animal rights advocate, a line of work that I never ever thought that I would be getting into, but now one that I can't imagine my life without. As I say, I began life on YouTube as a person who was discussing the philosophy of religion, debating the religious. And I was sometimes dealing with people who would blindly follow their faith into some of the most evil and irrational of doctrines and behaviors. I was no stranger to irrationality, to people living in denial, to faith-based thinking. But I have to say, ladies and gentlemen, that despite my years of arguing with religious fanatics and dogmatic Christian nationalists and would-be theocrats, I have genuinely never witnessed more dogma, more ignorance, more evil, right, more faith-based thinking, and indeed I might even say more religiosity than I've ever seen when I started talking about animal rights. I mean, the Christian right wing doesn't even come close in terms of the kind of dogma and ignorance that we're dealing with. And the faith-based thinking, the following blindly, just doing what you think is right because you're just essentially a slave to your traditions. This, if I'm honest, the reactions that I was receiving, these kinds of reactions, only made me want to talk about it more. A lot of people weren't very happy with this shift when I started talking about this. I mean, first this kid comes for the creator of the heavens and the earth, the Alpha and the Omega, and as if that wasn't bad enough, now he wants me to give up eating bacon too. Well, yes, I'm afraid to say. Because this point isn't just one of philosophical musing, this is more a point of duty. And in fact, the most basic duty and the most self-evident duty that we can possibly have as ethical beings, that's to avoid inflicting suffering where it can be avoided. A quote attributed to Carl Sagan that is very commonly repeated among the atheist skeptic community is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. It's a favorite among skeptics, you'll have heard it all the time. Some people call it Hitchens' razor because of how he liked to employ the term. I would like to humbly add to this great tradition by suggesting a razor of my own. That extraordinary harm and mistreatment requires extraordinary justification. This seems at least as true to me as Carl Sagan's pithy maxim. And yet when reflecting on a treatment of animals, it's not just the case that we don't have extraordinary justification for extraordinary harms. We don't even have ordinary justifications, even for the most basic mistreatment of animals that we currently partake in. I think not enough time is spent reflecting on the fact that in the normal course of human ethical intuition, the more innocent the victim, the more we think they require and deserve our attention and special moral concern. Right? That seems obvious, right? It's worse for me to smack a baby than to smack an adult, because one is so much more innocent than the other. But once you cross the species boundary, this intuition seems to be exactly reversed. Now, the more defenseless, the more innocent, the more domitable the being, the more we feel we have a right to abuse them. And let me remind you, right, we're talking about, I don't need to explain to a room full of vegans that we're talking about torture and abuse, but what I will remind you is that in a human context, in liberal thinking at least, when it comes to torture, think about this. When you hear about this as a method of war or something like this, we don't justify torturing our enemies, even when we have a good reason to do it. And yet we do justify torturing the most innocent members of our moral community simply to appease our taste buds. Our ethical intuitions exactly reverse themselves for no good reason. And the worst thing, the very worst thing about this, is that those who are paying for this don't think they need to give an explanation at all, because it's just a burger, right? It's us, it's the vegans who are putting forward the affirmative case who need to do the explaining, right? And I'm here to tell you, right, that this is what I think, this is a takeaway that I'd like you all to leave with, is that if we're going to make it anywhere as a movement, we need to fix this. Eating animals is not the neutral position. If you walk into KFC and buy a bargain bucket, you are demonstrating that you implicitly accept an ideology that says that you have the ethical warrant to harm an animal for the sake of your taste pleasure. Now, say what you like about that kind of belief, but don't tell me that's the neutral position. Don't tell me that we're the ones with the ideology for wishing for this to end. That's not how it works. When I refuse to kill another human being, I'm not doing something affirmative, I'm refraining from doing something. And when I refuse to kill another animal, I'm not doing something, I'm refraining. Now, why is this important? Well, what is the biggest problem that the vegan community currently faces? If you ask me, it's PR. I hate to have to say. We have a bit of a bad image, right? Whenever we get a mention in the news or on social media, God forbid, TikTok, it's always that we're extreme, fanatical, we seem frantic, this kind of stuff. Now, why is this the case? I actually think this is quite understandable when we consider that most people see veganism as the affirmative thing. I mean, think about what we're talking about. We're talking about mutilation, we're talking about bolt gunning, gas chambers, diseases, all kinds of horrible stuff, right? Of course the rhetoric is going to sound extreme. The extremity of our discourse is only reflective of the extremity of what we're doing to animals, right? And so once it becomes clear that veganism is a reaction to this, rather than its proposition, then those people who are pointing their fingers at extremity will realize that actually they are correct to do so. They are pointing at extremity, but the finger should be pointing in the opposite direction. When you realize that this all comes down to the fact that veganism is seen as the thing that's done, and eating meat is seen as the thing that's not done, that's where I think the basic problem lies. Vegans also, unfairly, I think, of course, have a reputation of trying to force their views on other people. I'm sure you'll have heard this charge yourself, which is not true, by the way. I don't even know what that would look like. Where are these roaming gangs of vigilante vegans holding people at gunpoint, forcing them to eat a tofu burger? It's nonsense. It doesn't exist. But I'm glad to hear from these people that they seem to not like when people force their opinions on others. I'd take them a lot more seriously, I have to say, if they would stop forcing their opinions upon animals, right? That would make me take them a lot more seriously. After all, live and let live only works if you let live, right? Seems obvious to me. And what I think they mean when they say this is that vegans like to force other people into considering the consequences of their actions. This is a fairer claim. I think this is more accurate. But I have to say that what I wish, the answer to this, that I wish someone had the gall to say to me before I was vegan a few years ago, is quite simple. Right? I'll accept the charge that we try to force people into unwarranted, into uncomfortable conversations, but let me put it plainly. If you have the right to force a pig into a gas chamber, then you can be damn sure I have the right to force you into a conversation about your justification for doing so. But of course, I don't need to tell any of you this. This is just a way to get a cheap applause for the sake of a good YouTube video. The fact that you're all here just means that you're already sympathetic to the vegan message, at least. But I wanted to give you an idea of why I've ended up here today, on this stage today, despite once being such a lover of meat that they knew my order in KFC without even having to ask. I want to speak about why, as an atheist, I began to feel a true affinity with the vegan community. Surprisingly, the debate around veganism and the debate about religion actually have some interesting parallels. As I briefly mentioned, I don't think I mentioned, atheism is not a thing that people do, right? It's a thing that people don't do. And yet, despite this, historically, atheism has been called radical, extreme, insensitive to important traditions, Inconvenient, just something a bunch of kind of young radicals get together and blindly follow. Sound familiar? Anybody? Right? Seems to me that when I first heard that veganism has a reputation for these things too, I began to hear the echoes of people who'd been saying this about atheists for centuries, and for the whole time been talking out of there are children here. Their digestive system appears to be working in reverse. Put it that way. Now, vegans have, I think, unfortunately, a reputation for being of quite an evangelical bent themselves, and so one of the most boring claims that I hear, that people try to shut me up about animal rights, especially because I used to be an atheist, or I used to talk about atheism, I should say, is the claim that by becoming a vegan, I've joined a new religion myself. I'm sure you'll have heard this too, this charge that veganism is some kind of religion. To be plain, whilst religion is a faith-based pursuit, based in wishful thinking and the desire for supernatural consolation, it takes absolutely no faith, none, to recognize the undeniable truth of animal suffering, and believe me, it doesn't provide any consolation. At least for the religious, the concept of hell, as disgusting and threatening a concept that it is, the concept of hell is something that already exists. Right? It's already there. God made it. It's not their fault that hell exists. And we only experience it after we're dead. And even all of this is based on, shall we say, tentative evidence, right? Animal farming, conversely, creates hell where it didn't exist before, and doesn't just use it as a threat for bad behavior, but proactively breeds beings into existence just to experience it for the entirety of their life, and where the religious, in my view, don't have nearly enough evidence to support the claim that their hell actually exists, and could do with a lot more of it. Factory farms have the exact opposite problem of having an overwhelming amount of evidence that their hell on earth does truly exist, that they have to try and obfuscate or deny. As my friend Steve Woodford once said to me, if you were the devil and you were trying to create the worst possible experience for animals just for the sake of suffering itself, you actually couldn't do much better than what we're already doing to them on factory farms. And to press this evidence, they do, right? Or at least they try their best. We're all familiar with the propaganda that we see flooding our supermarket aisles, free range, happy cows, all of this kind of stuff, which is, of course, nothing more than a fantasy. You can stick a free range label on chickens that are housed, or on eggs that come from chickens that are housed in barns at a density of 9 chickens per square meter, and whose male populations have been massacred at birth because they won't produce any eggs. But don't worry, the sticker seems to suggest that the chickens were perfectly fine with it. These companies think we're stupid, and they're right, given how willing people are to uncritically accept this kind of stuff and these ridiculous labels without even a hint of skepticism that maybe, just maybe, companies that are dedicated to producing as much animal flesh for as cheaply as possible might just allow animal welfare standards to slip by the side. So, why is it that so many of my atheist colleagues don't bring this up? I mean, the problem of evil for God's existence is made 1,000 times worse when you consider the plight of animals. Why don't I spend a lot of time thinking, why don't more of my atheist colleagues talk about this? Why is it only us? And I think it's because, for a lot of them, if they were to point to the heavens and say, how can you call yourself a good God while allowing so many animals to suffer? The heavens could point right back and say, well, how can you call yourself a moral person and continue to pay for these animals to suffer? That's why they're not talking about it. This can really help. This can really help our case. I also campaign for the secularization of the United Kingdom, a country which, let's face it, doesn't care about Jesus in the way that it used to. I think it should be secularized. But secularism isn't just good for the human animal. It's not just good for protecting the rights of religious minorities and atheists to live as they please. In the United Kingdom, it's a legal requirement to stun animals before you kill them. Now, this shouldn't cheer you up, by the way, because the stunning can take the form of, for instance, a gas chamber, which is considered by the government, if you kill animals in a gas chamber, to be a form of stunning and killing at the same time, in a case of, can I really say, killing 2 birds with 1 stone? There, I've said it now. That's what they consider to be the justification. It's a legal requirement to stun animals before you kill them. That is, unless you're killing the animal in a religious slaughter. Right? You get an exemption from that legal requirement, that basic legal requirement, if you are performing the slaughter for the sake of religious food. Now, one of the requirements stated in the UK government to slaughter, say, animals for halal meat is that the person doing the slaughtering must be a Muslim. Similarly, if you want to do Jewish ritual slaughter, legally you have to be Jewish. What does this mean? It means that if I walk into an abattoir and I slit a cow's throat without stunning it and watch it bleed out on the floor, I've committed a criminal offense if I haven't stunned it first. I've acted illegally. But if I convert to Islam first, or convert to Judaism and go and do the same thing to the same animal, now it's perfectly fine. Now it's legally A-OK. As I say, secularism and the cause for a secular United Kingdom is not just good for the human animal. So look, the considerations of animal suffering are incredibly useful to people from my old community, from people who want to talk about atheism and secularism. So why aren't more of them talking about it? I mean, I don't know if you've seen people like Sam Harris flop around like a fish out of water when asked about veganism because he just can't bring himself to say anything of worth without admitting that his own moral theory obliges him to veganism. Richard Dawkins, for what it's worth, at least recognizes what he perceives to be as a moral hypocrisy. But imagine if on any other subject, imagine if we were talking about anything from petty theft to abduction, and somebody said, not just that they think it's permissible, that they recognize it's impermissible, but I guess I'm just a hypocrite. We wouldn't accept this line of thought from any other kind of ethical thinking, and we shouldn't accept it on this issue either, and I think too many people are willing to do so. The problem is, I think the problem is that many people simply refuse to address this because doing so would require them to change the way they eat and to probably alienate some of their following. I mean, we can't seriously pretend that people as intelligent as Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, pick your public intellectual, don't know the problem exists and don't know how serious it is. Of course they do. They have to be simply ignoring it. So if you're wondering why certain public intellectuals refuse to breathe a word about veganism despite being constantly asked to, I think it's worth reflecting on a line from Jonathan Safran Foer's wonderful book on eating animals. He writes that it's always possible to wake someone from sleeping, but it's impossible to wake somebody who is pretending to be asleep. George Orwell, in an essay called My Country, Right or Left, writes about World War I, and which he lived through, right? And he rather bluntly states that although after the war was finished, he and other people looked back upon it with as if it was one of the greatest tragedies to ever befall humanity, just an obvious, horrendous, terrible course of events. He writes that while he was living through the war, no particular event, no particular battle particularly moved him, right? Yeah, sure, it was bad, but it wasn't tragic in the way that it is when we look back. He said that it's only retrospectively, once the war was over, that you look back and see everything as it was for a whole, that you recognize the obscene tragedy of the situation. Now, I think that the exploitation of animals will be viewed in the same way. If you're confused, as I once was, about why everybody around you seems to be participating in an obvious evil, I think it's helpful to think in this way. Right? After all, Christopher Browning famously observed that it was ordinary men who were guarding Auschwitz. And whilst there may be genuine malice at the top of these industries, I think that these industries of animal exploitation are mostly buttressed by ordinary people, participating in what they just consider to be ordinary behaviors. But if future historians, as I believe they will, are looking back upon us now and seeing this as the defining ethical question of our time, as I think they will obviously do, then those eyes of history will be counting you either among the oppressors or the liberators, as Peter Singer wrote. And you've got to make that choice. When history looks back, you're going to be put in one of those two camps. Which do you want it to be? And I'm so glad to see so many people here today, obviously on the right side of that particular question. It's wonderful, truly. After all, it is an immense task that we have ahead of us. Right? We are asking, for the first time in human history, the first time ever, I don't think enough time is spent reflecting on this, it's never happened before, that we are asking for a moral revolution for the sake of those who can't speak for themselves. Okay, never before in human history, ever, has there been a moral revolution in which the victims of the injustice couldn't make their own case for their liberation and had to wait on and rely upon their oppressors to make the case for them. Right? It's a pretty horrible situation we're in, and although this makes it so much more difficult, I think it makes it all the more proud and defining as well, because of the fact that this is the first evidence, this movement, I believe, is the first evidence that we have that mankind is capable of procuring justice against the oppressed, even when it was never directly asked for by the victims themselves. It's the first time ever that mankind has stretched his moral arm outside of himself to embrace those who've been silently suffering, to prove that justice can come about not as a result of social pressure from the victims of injustice, but from a genuine concern at all levels of society about what is simply right. This, ladies and gentlemen, is what distinguishes true justice from mere self-interest. It's a willingness to fight against injustice, even if we're not the ones who suffer from it. That's why we're here. That's what this event is all about, and I am proud to be the first speaker among many this weekend trying to bring about that goal. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks so much to everybody that came out this year to Vegan Camp Out. It was so wonderful to meet so many of you, and I hope that you enjoyed it just as much as I did. But I also wanted to take a moment before this video closes to thank the sponsor of this video, and a company that makes trips and videos like this continually possible. So here's a message from me to you about protecting your online security with ExpressVPN. ExpressVPN is a virtual private network that offers a fairly straightforward but crucially important service, protecting your online security. When you're browsing online, lots of things are happening behind the scenes that you might not realize. For instance, in my country, internet service providers are required by law to keep logs of every website that I visit. It's a bit creepy, especially knowing that this data can then be sold to advertisers. That is, our online information being shared with big companies for profit. Also, if you're using an unencrypted Wi-Fi network, you leave yourself vulnerable to hackers on the same network who can steal your data and use it for even more nefarious purposes. This is all true, of course, if you don't use a VPN. And this is why I've been using ExpressVPN for some time now. It's a simple app that runs on your computer or smartphone, which with the click of a button masks my IP address by rerouting my data through a separate secure server, which allows me to browse and work much more anonymously. Now my internet service provider can't use or sell my data. Now, many VPNs can slow down your internet speed, but ExpressVPN is lightning fast, meaning I don't even notice that it's on. They also have 24/7 customer support with a live chat function, meaning that your questions, if you have any, can be answered within seconds rather than hours. And the best part of all of this is that you can get 3 months of all these wonderful benefits completely for free, simply by using my referral code. Just go to expressvpn.com/CosmicSkeptic and start to enjoy your online security being protected by ExpressVPN.